it's like, we don't educate people that way. We only
Yeah.
educate them on these other things that end up meaning absolutely nothing if you don't have your health. Like all of the, advanced geometry in the world doesn't mean anything if you don't, know how to feed yourself, because you're going to end up being sick.
Hello, Sarah. Welcome to the Peace, Love, Hormones podcast. I'm so excited to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, introduce yourself to everyone. Who are you? What do you do? And why do you do it?
Sure. So I am author of This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, How the Pill Changes Everything. And I'm also a researcher and a psychologist at TCU up in Fort Worth. And I'm the lead science advisor now for 28 Wellness.
Oh, that is amazing. I did see that. I have really loved following you in your work, and we connected briefly at the showing of the documentary, The Business of Birth Control, which for anyone listening and watching this who hasn't seen it yet, please go ahead and see it. It's so powerful. And why you and I initially connected to get you on the podcast, even though there are so many things that we could talk about and so many reasons why I would love to have you on the Peace, Love, Hormones podcast, it was right after that Washington Post article that totally took over the internet for right reason, just because so many of us, women, practitioners, researchers alike, were furious by the article. So before we get into your work specifically around birth control, around neural health as well as it pertains to hormonal contraceptives, I would love to hear your thoughts on that article. I know them, but I would love for all of our listeners to hear them because we are all on the same page over here.
Yeah, no. So I ended up, which I'm sure that you saw, writing a piece about it that is in Evie magazine, which is available for everybody online if they want to download it. But, I was appalled. I mean, just like everybody was appalled. I was appalled at the dismissing of women's concerns about side effects. I felt like they completely missed the whole story, because to me, the story that you tell when you find out that women are learning about and discussing birth control side effects and that are going to their doctors and they're doing all of this background research on social media, the story is that the state of women's healthcare is so abysmal that women have to look for information about birth control side effects on social media. Like that's the story. And it really was disgusting to me that instead of making that the story and putting women in the position, I mean, women are in a desperate position when they're having to have discussions about birth control because they don't have all of the information. They don't know what to expect from it. Their doctors won't have thoughtful conversations with them oftentimes. And this isn't true for all doctors. There are plenty of really well-intentioned, thoughtful doctors, but I mean, appointment times are very short. A lot of times the doctors don't have access to the research literature that's publishing on some of the sort of, for example, psychological and behavioral side effects that are related to birth control. And also birth control side effects are so idiosyncratic and person specific that it's really hard to capture them all in research just because of the way that science works. And as somebody who is a scientist and spends my career as a researcher, like I'm intimately aware of how messy data are and how hard it is to get, sort of main differences between, for example, women who use the pill and women who don't use the pill on some sort of a dimension that you're measuring. And so it was really the idea that, as the authors of that terrible Washington Post piece were putting it, while women should just essentially just shut up and take their pills like they used to, because, all of this, false information that is, and they tried to politicize it and say that it was like being planted by the right-wing media, and none of this is real. And I mean, surely there's some of that. I mean, I'm sure that there's all kinds of crazy things that go on. But this issue is just far too important to be trying to politicize it. And yeah, it just really was demeaning to women and women's concerns and didn't address what the real issue is. And that is that women who are using hormonal birth control are in a position where they're told so little about what it's doing to their body. And their doctors are so cavalier about it and just like, will give them birth control, which changes their profile of sex hormones, and they'll give it to them for anything. The
Mm-hmm.
systemic medicine that causes systemic changes in the body. And we're just supposed to pretend like it's not a big deal and that we're not
Right.
worried about it and just take it without asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's really sad.
Exactly. And then when we do walk into the office and we say X, Y, and Z is going on, most women are dismissed as well. So that's like the icing to the cake.
Yeah, I know. It's like so
Yeah.
many of us have had the experience of going to the doctor and talking about having this effect or that effect. And they're like, oh, well, you can just take this other pill, like take an antidepressant, or, oh, give it another week, or,
Hmm. We'll
oh, I've
change
never
the
heard of that.
hormones. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's probably something else. Your
Right.
life is probably
Hmm.
stressful. And yeah, and I think that it's women are finally getting to a point, and I think social media has given women a gathering space to have these
Hmm.
conversations. But it's like women are finally actually having conversations with other people about the thing that's going on. And I think that it's been very empowering to women to learn that they're not alone. And I think
Totally.
that when
Yeah.
they learn that they're not alone and that they're not crazy and that these experiences that they're having are shared by other people, I think that's it's a powerful place for women. And because of that, we're starting to take a stand and
Hmm.
asking, demanding more options and demanding more information.
Yeah, well, I'll never forget too the first time I really brought this conversation up with a group of girlfriends. I was in undergrad at the time, and it just felt so taboo to even talk about it with a group of my close peers, asking, "Hey, are y'all on birth control? What form of birth control are you on? Do you also feel the way that I feel?" And that was the first conversation that I had in person with people about it. And it was super eye opening to me because number one, I finally understood, okay, I'm not alone. Thank goodness. I'm not alone here. And, most of us, I learned from, not just that conversation, but my research afterwards, that most of us are united by that. And it's a really comforting thing. It's unfortunate, but also comforting at the same time to know that if you're talking to another woman who has been prescribed birth control throughout her life, chances are it's like a super high percentage, like 95+% will say they had a negative experience with it too. Maybe different than my experience, but still negative nonetheless. So it was very comforting, but just so crazy that, I mean, that wasn't that long ago, 8 or so years ago, but still it was so taboo at the time. And again, with my close girlfriend. So I have personally loved seeing the the movement of women talking about this, both on social media, but outside of social media as well. Now, I think that I know that there's misinformation all around, and the health and wellness community and the social community is not immune to that. But I totally agree with every single thing that you said about that article. And it just didn't paint a holistic picture. It was very, very one sided. They only interviewed one doctor and it was a male. And it's just, come on, like, why? We're so used to this narrative, but why are we still working with this narrative of, doctor, male or female, but in this case, male, who's dismissing women's experiences on the pill or the IUD or the shot, the implant, etc. So on that note, because you had brought up science and being a scientist, you know the ins and outs of science, and there can be really great science, and then also a research study can look really neat and put together, but also could be missing the mark massively. So, can you talk about science as it pertains to women's health, where we are lacking and how we are improving, especially from like 1993, for example, and before that even?
Yeah, I mean, the state of research on women and especially women's health is absolutely abysmal,
Mm-hmm.
and things have gotten marginally better recently, but the state of affairs is pretty bad. And just to give you to orient you to what it looks like, up until even 1992, 1993, researchers were publishing papers like normal human aging, and it was research conducted only on men, right? And so it was this idea that here's all of these processes that go on in the body that's normal for people, and it's not normal for people, it's just normal for men. But for a very, 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 very long time, many fields only studied men just because men don't have cyclically changing sex hormones. And because men's hormones don't change cyclically, it makes them a little bit easier to study, because the fact of the matter is you can just call a guy, have him come into the research lab, draw his blood, And you can make a pretty good guess that what's happening in his body on that day that you studied him will still be going on in his body 14 days later. And with a woman, you can't be so certain about that, just because when our hormones change cyclically, if you measure a woman initially in the season of estrogen, for example, the different types of biological processes going on in her body may be different than what's going on 14 days later when she's in the season of progesterone, just because our sex hormones flip a bunch of switches in the body. And so it creates this kind of moving target when you're doing research, and it makes it more difficult for scientists to make substantial, like a substantive kind of cause and effect conclusions about things, just because, if you're not really careful about when you measure women, like, and measure them at the same time in every time that you measure them, like at the same cycle point, that it can sort of mess with your results if you're trying to say, well, this caused that. If you measured a woman at a different cycle phase, it's possible that what was responsible for the effect was just that she had a hormonal change.
So essentially, you're saying a lot of scientists and researchers are lazy.
Yeah, well,
Because it would take a lot more. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, on the one hand, it's unacceptable, and it is, the state of affairs is absolutely unacceptable, and this still goes on in many fields, by the way. So in preclinical neuroscience, where a lot of the research is being done on animal models, it's overwhelmingly done on male only animals. And so even things like trying to understand the mechanisms of Alzheimer's disease, which is a disease that overwhelmingly strikes women compared to men, almost all of the preclinical work is done exclusively on male animals.
Oh,
And the fact of
crazy.
the matter is, the more that we sort of understand about the way that the world works, the more that we understand that biological males and biological females are different creatures. And some of the even like processes that we can't even really see with our naked eye, like the way that our cells do different types of things or deal with different types of challenges, can differ very dramatically depending on whether the cell came from a biological male or a biological female.
Absolutely.
And so it's really hard to, with a straight face, look at research that's done on males and know that it's going to apply to females. And oftentimes it doesn't. And this is the reason that, we see that 8 out of 10 prescription drugs, soon after they get approval by the FDA and hit the shelves, will get recalled within the first year because of unanticipated side effects in women. And it's because they don't study us enough.
Right.
And so it's this really unacceptable state of affairs. And, for scientists, being one, this is unfortunately a practice that's been rewarded and encouraged by the fact that there's a lot of pressure on people who do research to publish things quick and cheap. And if you can get away with publishing things on males only and call the name of the article, for example, aging in humans, when it's only done on men, and you can get that published in a really high quality journal and you can get the research funded, that's what you're going to do. Because if you don't publish research papers quickly in science, you get fired. And scientists just want to keep their jobs. So they're trying to do their things. And so the change needs to start from the top. And the change needs to start with the funding agencies. And it needs to start with the people who publish the results of scientific research. And they need to say that it's absolutely unacceptable to not only not publish things unless it includes both males and females, but that it needs to include enough numbers of males and females where they can actually test for sex differentiation. Because what currently is going on is, now that the federal government has said, we won't fund any more medical research that's done on males only. Like, you need to have males and females. What researchers are doing is they're just sprinkling in a handful of females, right? So like, it's a sample of like 50 men, sprinkle in a couple of women, and now all of a sudden they can get their research funded. and that's not fair. And all that it does is monkey up the results of the research that they're doing in men, because it's going to make it messy. And then you never are able to test for sex differentiation. I think that science needs to change in a way where the assumption is sex differentiation. Like, before we get started in research, that we need to, like, we start with the working assumption that male and female bodies are going to respond to things differently, and then test things adequately in males and females. And testing females at, at least 2 points in the cycle, like once when they're in the season of estrogen and once when they're in the season of progesterone. Because I'm
Exactly.
actually working on a book right now talking about this very issue. And that is, most of what we know about women that's actually been done in research on women has all been done in the early follicular phase.
Exactly.
So it's all been done in the season of estrogen. And
Mhm.
so then we get into the luteal phase and our bodies respond in crazy ways. And we wonder why we feel terrible for 2 weeks out of the cycle.
Right.
And it's because
Oh.
we've been acting with this totally wrong set of guidelines that don't
Mhm.
fit us during those 2 weeks. So
Well, yeah, and
anyway,
outside of research too, just even in the doctor's office and running labs, usually those labs are run unless you're getting a functional lab done. Conventional labs test women in their early follicular phase too. And so it doesn't give us a big picture at all. So just wanted to make that correlation as well of it's not just
that's
happening in research,
true.
it's happening everywhere, you know?
Yeah, no,
Mhm.
it's really astounding. And especially the more that we understand about just how involved our sex hormones are in terms of the different
Mhm.
processes in our body. I mean, it's nuts to me,
Yeah.
that we would use research conducted on men to make, any sort of recommendations for what women should be doing. And we see what
Mhm.
happens when we do that. I mean, we had
Oh my
for
gosh, yeah.
years, they were recommending that women take baby aspirin for their cardiovascular health. And then it turned out
Oh,
not to be helpful to women and
yeah.
actually increased their risk of hemorrhaging.
Mm.
So not
Oh
good.
my goodness.
I mean, and
Yeah.
now, it's like if we include any, if we're actually doing research on women, yeah, all in the early follicular phase, we have absolutely no idea what's going on in the luteal phase.
Right.
And it's like nobody's thinking to just change the way that we're asking the question. It's like when researchers finally started studying women, they did it in a way that was using the male model, like
Mhm.
better once, and that'll do it.
Exactly. Yeah, and even just, the whole the story situation how estrogen was discovered first and so everyone just ran with that of like estrogen is the female hormone and just totally leaving out progesterone, and progesterone is equally as important, arguably if not
Yes.
more important. So it's, it
Yeah, no, that's a big beef I have.
me
That
too,
was
Sarah. You and
that's
I both.
that's so funny. Yeah, like to me, I was just at a research talk about this, in fact. And so
Mhm.
one of the things that I love the most about progesterone, and we can have a love affair talk about progesterone and how
Yeah.
amazing it is.
I love
But
it.
as as somebody who is a psychologist and studies the brain and all the other things I do, like one of the things I love the most about progesterone is like it's like super neuroprotective.
Yeah.
Like they give it to people when they have traumatic brain injury because it
Mhm.
calms down like excitotoxicity that you can get when you have traumatic brain
Mhm.
injury. And it's like it's just really good for the adaptability and flexibility of the brain, and it's neuroprotective, and it promotes BDNF, which is something
Mhm.
that makes us think better and makes us smarter.
Yep. Yeah.
And when you look at the research that's being done in neuroscience on Alzheimer's disease, and they're finally starting to look at women's sex hormones because
Mhm.
women are overwhelmingly the
Finally.
ones who are hit with it. What do you
Uh-huh.
think they're looking at?
The brain, hopefully.
Estrogen.
Oh, oh, that's what. Okay, yeah. But as it pertains to
Yeah.
brain health, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't set up the question right. But no,
Brain
they're
and
looking.
estrogen, yeah.
Yeah, they're looking at
Oh my
estrogen, and it's like,
goodness.
ah, like here we have this like really neuroprotective hormone that we know does all of these really great things that promote neuroplasticity and da 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 da, and all these other things that would be therapeutic in the context of the menopausal transition and Alzheimer's disease, and they're just like looking at estrogen.
Oh my goodness. I'm just shaking my head over here the whole time. Anyone watching the YouTube will have a great a great experience watching this. I'm either just shaking my head no or yes this entire episode.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. Yeah, when it comes to progesterone, I do research every single day to varying amounts, but I really try to actually focus and save a lot of my studying and research for the luteal phase for that reason as well. And so it's just bonkers. I don't know how else to say it. Everyone who listens to this podcast is on the same page too, because this is all we talk about over here. So it's just crazy. And too about the research, before we conclude on that end, and of course, if you had anything else you wanted to add, testing women and differentiating or explicitly stating, are we testing on menopausal women? Or are we testing on a woman in her 20s who is off of birth control? It's just so different, like very different as well and different findings. And even a woman in her 20s who's on hormonal birth control versus a woman in her 20s who's not, a woman who was on birth control for 10 plus years beforehand and now isn't versus a woman who was never on birth control. So there are a lot of factors that go into it, but there's no excuse for not testing it nonetheless. It's insane. It's insanity.
It is insane. It is.
So birth control. And I'm even looking at your poster behind you of your book. Everyone, please go read it, listen to it. Is it on audiobook?
It is.
Okay.
And
Great.
I have to say, I love the person they're having reading it. So I got to actually, fun fact, I got to listen to different people reading it and like pick my favorite.
Oh,
and
I love that.
I picked the same one that my publisher picked, and she does such a good job of like punctuating like the way that I talk, and that sounds like I do, and which is really good because that book has a kind of a little bit of personality, and
as it should.
Yeah, and the reader has she's got this really great personality. So yeah, it's available on audiobook, and it's a really nicely done one.
Amazing. Okay, well, this is Your Brain on Birth Control, How the Pill Changes Everything, and we'll link it up in the show notes of this episode as well. So when it comes to hormonal birth control, can you talk about number one, in your opinion, what are the pros and the cons of hormonal birth control? Let's start off with that.
Yeah, so I mean, pros, the big, huge pro, and it's a big pro, is that it is safe, reliable, easy to access, easy to use pregnancy prevention. And pregnancy prevention is by far the single issue that has for a very long time separated women from men in their ability to get educational attainment and achieve financial independence. Because for a very long time, before women had access to safe and easy to use and really effective contraception, when women were going out to live their dreams and meet their goals, a lot of times they would end up getting unexpectedly benched because of pregnancy. And it's a lot more difficult, not only to meet your goals, but even to make plans when there's always this looming storm cloud of the possibility of an unplanned pregnancy. And the birth control pill, by offering, again, sort of accessible, easy to use, incredibly effective contraception, allows women to make plans. And when we're able to make plans, even though, there's a lot of right-wing conservative folks who are like, oh, access to birth control will make women, into these risk-taking, whatever, women of the night. What it actually ended up doing was it made us incredibly responsible, productive, and now we're out achieving men by a mile.
Heck yes.
And a lot of that is because we are able to make plans. And so I think that is obviously that's a really huge benefit. And that's a benefit that you get from contraception in general, right? And the thing that makes the pill so special is just that it's so effective and it's so easy to use. It's it's just something, and it's accessible. Most people are able to access it. And so it gives this level of assurance that allows people to go or allows women to go and meet their goals. And so that's obviously a really big benefit. Oh, another benefit. For women who have severe PMDD, sometimes the birth control pill can be very palliative. Because what it does is it irons out, it suppresses your own sex hormone production. So your own sex hormones are flatlined, and then it replaces them with a daily synthetic. And getting that same hormonal message every day can be really helpful to women who have PMDD, who are sensitive to hormonal fluctuations, because some women's symptoms get triggered by hormonal changes. And obviously ironing all of those out can be helpful. And for some women who aren't able to manage PMDD and PMS symptoms other ways, it can be really palliative. And it's also an easy, it's a relatively easy solution for things like endometriosis and PCOS, because again, you're shutting down women's sex hormone production. And when you're not producing your own sex hormones, you don't get overproliferation of your uterine lining from estrogen like you do in the case of endometriosis, and you don't get PCOS because you don't get those hormonal imbalances. So those are some of the benefits. It can provide a Band-Aid to some certain types of problems, and obviously it is hugely beneficial in terms of pregnancy prevention.
Yes, worded very well. So now, at what cost?
I mean, look, when you take hormonal birth control, you are like shutting down your own production of hormones, right? So your own production of sex hormones gets leveled, and then you're replacing it every day with the same hormonal message. And the hormonal message is one that is of relatively low levels of estrogen. Right? So many combination hormonal birth control pills have progestin, which is synthetic progesterone, and then also a little bit of estrogen. And then there's also products that only have the progestin, right? So they don't have any estrogen at all. So every day you're just getting the same hormonal message. And the thing about this hormonal message is, one, the thing that it does is it shuts down the HPG axis. So it tells the brain, you don't need to stimulate the ovaries to make an egg because we're doing just fine over here. Thank you very much. And when our body doesn't produce any sex hormones and we're just getting the same hormonal message of relatively high levels of progestin or relatively low levels of estrogen, we never get the benefits of estrogen, right? And some of the things that estrogen does that we love is that it tends to make us feel sexy and energetic, and it causes the birth of new dendritic spines on our neurons, and it makes us feel awake and alive and energized and yes. And so that's one of the things that we get when we shut down production of sex hormones and take hormonal birth control, is that women are experience this sort of blunting of this really vibrant sort of sexually motivated, sexy kind of part of themselves that naturally cycling women get when they're in the season of estrogen. So that's one of the things that goes on. Another set of things that goes on is all about those wonky synthetic progesterone molecules.
Yes.
Yeah.
The progestins. Oh, goodness.
Progestin.
Yes.
So you and I spent some time fangirling over progesterone and how amazing it is. And the reason that progesterone is so amazing is that when it gets metabolized in the body, it releases a really potent neurosteroid called allopregnanolone. And allopregnanolone is awesome because it stimulates GABA A receptors in our brain. And that has the effect of calming the brain down. It slows the rate of neurotransmission, and it has this very sort of calming, soothing, neuroplasticity promoting effect on the brain. So it's a very powerful chemical. It's great for mood. It's great for regulating things like learning. It's a really great compound. Progestins are not made from progesterone. They are mostly synthesized from testosterone. And there's another one, spironolactone, which is synthesized from a diuretic, spironolactone. So when your body is breaking these synthetic progesterone or progestins down, it does not lead to the release of this neurosteroid. It doesn't lead to the release of allopregnanolone. And this is actually one of the primary sources of GABAergic activity in women's brains. One of the big sources that our bodies have relied on for all of our history as a human species has been, it's sort of expecting that it's going to be getting this GABAergic activity coming from our progesterone. And so when we don't have that, it can cause problems. And some of those problems are related to things like anxiety, mental health problems. So having depression, for example, getting problems with regulating the stress response. So for example, we see that women who are on hormonal birth control, that they don't have the same cortisol response to stress that we see in women who are naturally cycling. And so you create this type of a hormonal situation that in a lot of ways is kind of the neurobiological Wild West. It's just not something that women have ever encountered in nature. And so, we get one set of side effects that we get because we're not experiencing the estrogen increase ever, because it's just got low across the cycle that you get when you're a naturally cycling woman. So one set of side effects that we get comes from that. Another set of side effects comes from the fact that we don't experience actual progesterone and allopregnanolone because we're not having any exposure to that. And that causes a set of side effects of its own. And then the last set of side effects that we get come from the fact that the progestins, because they were synthesized from something else, oftentimes they don't have perfect binding affinity to progesterone receptors, meaning that they'll bind and then fall off. And they also lack binding specificity. meaning that sometimes they'll stimulate receptors for hormones that aren't progesterone. So, for example, we know that second generation progestins, which are synthesized from testosterone, in addition to stimulating progesterone receptors, which is what, prevents ovulation from happening because your body is reading it as progesterone, but it also will stimulate testosterone receptors. And so, for example, this is a reason that some women, especially second generation progestins, are kind of bad for this one. They'll have these kind of masculinizing side effects where you'll get sometimes hair growth, like you get hair growth in your face, you get acne, you get weight gain, which is something that you get with too much androgenicity. And you also can get, they think that one of the reasons that women who are on hormonal birth control don't experience a cortisol response to stress like every other healthy functioning adult does is because the progestins in hormonal birth control, in addition, again, to stimulating progesterone receptors, also seem to be binding to glucocorticoid receptors, which might be creating in the body a sense that it's being overwhelmed with stress hormone, because glucocorticoid receptors are what bind cortisol. And if the body thinks that it's having too much cortisol release, it'll just shut down the stress response. And it'll just say, nope, none for you. And it does this because too much cortisol totally is completely disruptive to the body, because it channels all of the resources that our body uses for everyday maintenance of cell repair. So things like immune function and cell regeneration and all of those great things. And it takes all those resources and directs them toward dealing with the stress. And so our body will only allow that to happen for so long because we need to be repairing cells and all of those other things. So the body will just shut down the stress response and say, nope, no more for you. You don't get to do that anymore. That's a privilege, not a right.
Yeah.
And, So we get, different types of categories of side effects. And, some of the big ones, and some of the ones that I really talk about a lot in the book are we get changes in things like sexual desire and even attraction that are a result of, essentially flatlining estrogen, and not because estrogen is something that is very much about sexual desire and attraction. And when estrogen is high across the cycle, we're really cued into sexiness qualities in men. And when we never experience that estrogenic part of ourselves, then that, of course, can lead us to have diminished sexual desire and diminished, sort of feeling of sexiness and diminished sexual functioning. And it can even potentially change who we're attracted to and lead us to be less drawn to those sorts of really sexy, delicious qualities that women tend to really zero in on when estrogen is high across the cycle. So things like facial masculinity, behavioral masculinity. So whether somebody has sort of a dominant leadership oriented type of a personality. And it may sort of lead women to reprioritize other kinds of qualities. So for example, things like provisioning and caregiving. And so, so that's one set of issues. And then there's, like I said, these whole other sets of issues that come from mental health problems that can arise from not having exposure to allopregnanolone. And then also the types of mental health problems and just sort of random oddball side effects that we can get when you have these progestins that are stimulating not only progesterone receptors, but all kinds of different receptors throughout the brain and the rest of the body.
It's insane. That was such a long list, and I'm sure there's more to say and also more to learn as well. We're still figuring out what this is going to do to women in the long term, because it's, for lack of better words, it's still an experiment, an ongoing experiment of how this is really going to impact women on
absolutely. And especially, I was we know from adult women that if you give a 25-year-old hormonal birth control and, if she's on it for a year, 2 years or whatever, if she goes off of it within a couple of months, she'll probably be back to normal. Things will kind of go back to the way that they were before, because her brain was done developing. And, you get a little bit of adjustment that goes on. For example, if people are on hormonal birth control, even if they start as adults and they're on it for a really long time, it changes the number of hormone receptors that they have, because our body will adjust. If there's a lot of a hormone, we downregulate the receptors because they're we don't need so much of it. And if there's not a lot of it, it'll sprout more. So that way it's able to grab any molecules that are out there and be able to bind them. So you can get little changes like that. But where things are really the Wild West, I keep using this expression because this is all of women's health, honestly, where it is just like we're doing these experiments on generations of people and they have no idea that they're in them.
Right.
And one of the biggest experiments is on teenagers, and their brains are still developing. And so when you take a girl, especially who's like 19 or younger, and I use 19 or younger as the rule of thumb because by then most of your brain development is done. Like there's still some stuff going on, especially in the frontal lobes, but the majority of your the brain remodeling that goes on during puberty has been completed at that point. And if you go on hormonal birth control, chances are that any changes that are initiated by pill use or hormonal birth control use will go back to how things were before after you stop. But for these other girls who are 19 and younger, and they're still in the midst of the pubertal transition, where the brain is remodeling itself from its childhood version of itself into its grown-up version of itself. And this remodeling project is something that's coordinated by sex hormones. We don't know what happens when you start giving these women hormonal birth control, which is flatlining their own hormone production and then replacing them with this daily dose of synthetics. And, nobody is asking the research question. Very few people have studied this. I've only seen a very small handful of papers that have even asked the question of, hey, I don't know, like this might affect brain development and might this cause problems later on?
Right.
And the studies that I've seen that have actually bothered to ask the question do seem to suggest that if you go on it as a teenager, that it's going to put you at a greater risk of developing major depression over the course of your lifetime, even after you go off of it.
Right.
This is like a really serious issue. For some girls and moms, they still might make the decision to go on it because, for example, if you have somebody who's a sexually active child who could end up with an unplanned pregnancy, that would be really serious. And you have to sort of weight the seriousness of that against the seriousness of a risk for depression. But a lot of teenagers are being put on this by their doctors for things like pimples.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, and we don't know what that might be doing. Like, what are the long-term consequences of this? And none of this is being communicated to the parents and the children.
No, not at all. No, I mean, I was put on hormonal birth control at age 15 and neither my mom or I were told of what it's doing, how it's working, what could potentially happen in the near future and the later future. And I also went to a high school where you could go into the doctor's office within the high school and you could just get prescribed it by the nurse practitioners that were working at the school. And so I had a bunch of friends whose parents didn't even know. That was another thing, is like there was confidentiality. So you could go pick up your pack of birth control and they wouldn't tell your parents.
Right.
So it's crazy.
It is so crazy. And it goes to show you how much the medical establishment, and just societally, we've trivialized women's hormones. They've just seemed to be, they only matter when you're going to have a baby.
Exactly.
And instead of like, no, this is actually like a fundamental part of what your brain uses to create the experience of being the person you are.
It makes us who we are. Yeah. You had posted something that was like the pill, or I don't know if you said the pill, but birth control, the pill changes you because it changes your hormones, something along those lines.
Yeah.
And I was just like snapping over here. I was like, it's true. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Like I remember, like, so one of the chapters in my book is you are your hormones, because I just, it's just true. And I think that is something that nobody, it's like we only talk about, or what we learn about in school is about, hormones and, puberty and like all that stuff and like, your menstrual cycle, but that only matters if you're having a baby.
Right.
And, but not like, no, this is actually part of like what your brain uses as a communication to like make you the person you are. Like nobody says that. They don't tell us that.
Right.
And, if people actually understood that and were taught that, because we're not taught that.
We're not, no.
I think that we would take things like hormonal birth control a lot more seriously, but it's like we're not taught that at all.
No.
And in fact, I remember I went and I gave a talk to a group of women, and they were mostly in their like 40s, 50s, and even in their 60s. And I was talking to them just about hormones, and then I was talking about my book. And I just, I started it off with an initial, just primer on like, hey, here's how your cycle works or worked, and, and da da da. And for about 90% of the women in the room, this was the very first time that they'd ever heard about any of this.
Yeah.
And it's like the idea that you can be in your 60s,
Mm-hmm.
and never know and never be told how you work. It's just really absurd.
Yeah, it's like the confusion is still it's always there. It just changes when we're in our prime reproductive years. Our confusion is just, how are our hormones working? There are four phases of the cycle. How does this play into our lives, etc. And then as you grow throughout womanhood, the confusion stays during pregnancy and postpartum of like, what is happening to me? And then you reach peri and menopause, and the confusion is still there. And I see this with my mom and her friends who all the time are texting me like, what herb can I take, for this symptom? And I'm so happy that they're curious now, but it's also so sad that, again, they're just experiencing these symptoms and there's no explanation for them as to why it's happening. There's no insight into their own bodies and how they work. My grandma, my mom's mom, tells me all the time, she's like, I wish that I had you and, all of these, not just me, but like all of these lovely women on social media, is what she really means, to like, when she was younger, that is, to help guide her and let her know that she wasn't alone when she struggled with, she would call them her period blues in her dark days, because she would suffer from extreme PMS, or perhaps it was PMDD. Who knows? She was dismissed every single time she brought it up to her doctor, and it was very taboo. So, I mean, kind of to go 360 back to the Washington Post article, but it's not even the Washington Post. It's everywhere, right? It's everywhere in our society. It's a really good thing that women are talking about it, again, both on and off social media, because again, I've heard so many of my wise elders in my life say that they didn't have any of this when they were younger, and they struggled so much and just had no idea what was going on. So the confusion is shared just across the board.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I had to get a PhD to learn
To
how
learn
my
about
body
you.
works. And
I
to
know,
me,
yeah.
I mean, that's
It's
just like
ridiculous.
that's a height of absurdity. And the fact of the matter
Truly.
is, like, women, when you look at the consumers of health information, it's women.
Mm-hmm.
Women, like, we go to the doctor more frequently than men. We follow what our doctors tell us to do much more rigorously than men do. It's like we're very
Mm-hmm.
concerned with our physical well-being and
Mm-hmm.
our health, and yet we're not educated about it at all. And all of the education that, it's like each one of us has, like we get, if we're lucky, in like our senior year of high school, we get like a single semester of health where you cover for 2 days, something like the way that your brain works and the way the rest of your body works or whatever it is. And that's it. And then the rest of it is just left up to us to have to figure out on our own. And it's like, this is way too important to be leaving to, it's like the hole that has been created by our lack of education about any of this stuff is ripe to be filled with social media. It's like, thank goodness for having a platform where women are able to like do some investigative work into things that are important to them. But it's like that's not what we were taught. It's like, but I feel this way about, and I'm going to get on a different soapbox, but I feel this way about health related things in general. It's like, look at how little we're educated about like how to nourish our bodies, how to move our bodies, and all of these things. And the result is that we're overweight, we're sick, and everybody's wondering why young people are getting cancer. And it's like, people, you can't not educate people about how to take care of themselves or how their bodies work, so that way they can, because it's not very hard to figure out how to take care of yourself once you know what your body needs. But it's like, we don't educate people that way. We only educate them on these other things that end up meaning absolutely nothing if you don't have your health.
Right.
And it's like, like all of the advanced geometry in the world doesn't mean anything if you don't know how to feed yourself, because you're going to end up being sick and not being, it's just, anyway, it makes me so angry.
And in fact, no, I relate to that. I share that with you. It's not only are we not educating people on how to take care of themselves, but more often than not, we're actually educating them the opposite. It's like deeply ingrained in us from a young age. Just a lot of misconception of, this Oreo is healthier than a bite of red meat. It's like we're just given all of this confusion and misinformation around nutrition and sleep and lifestyle and stress management, stress reduction, and, labeling like herbal medicine as bad, right? But like OTCs and medications, great, like blindly trust that. So I feel like our society is a lot more backwards than not at times. Once I like step out of this niche and bubble that I'm in of, people like yourself, because I do feel very grateful for that being my day to day mostly, but there's still a lot of work to be done for sure. And before we close up this conversation and specifically on birth control, I want to know if you have any current credible research that connects hormonal birth control usage to later onset of postpartum anxiety and depression specifically. And I ask this because I know so many women in my life, so anecdotal, but still powerful nonetheless, who didn't struggle with anxiety or depression or anything like that. Not a lot, at least. Was never clinically diagnosed, stopped the pill, had a baby within 12 or so months of stopping the pill, and then had brutal postpartum anxiety and depression.
Really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Really interesting.
Maybe you and I will have to conduct that research together.
Yeah, no, so I don't know anything about that, but I mean, if I'm just spitballing here, if you have people who are on hormonal birth control a long time, you're getting the same hormonal message every day. And then you go into a state of pregnancy, right? And so women who are naturally cycling, we have to have a level of adaptability and flexibility to hormonal changes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's gnarly to develop because like, I don't know about you, but like for me, like puberty it was just a mess. And for a lot of women it is like, cause your cycle is kind of figuring itself out. Like your brain and your ovaries are learning how to communicate with each other. Your different hormone receptors on your cells are kind of having to learn how to like, oh, okay, now there's a lot of this. Oh, no, wait, now there's not a lot of this. And they're having to figure all of that out. And all of that learning process makes women who are naturally cycling, like we have a degree of hormonal flexibility where we are able to do this and our bodies are used to it. And if you have somebody who goes from this one state of, just like hormonal flatlining, and then they have this huge surge in hormones that happens during pregnancy, especially with progesterone, just a huge surge of hormones. And so, you're still not adept at, hormonal flexibility. And then all of a sudden that huge surge of hormones just crashes. I can imagine that could cause a lot of anxiety for somebody who's not very adept at navigating hormonal changes.
Yeah.
And,
absolutely.
Most of the research on things like PMS and PMDD, and it seems like the women who get PMS and PMDD are the ones who are most vulnerable to postpartum. It seems like all of those factors are really triggered by the changing hormones is like, it tends to be the triggering point rather than just like a straight withdrawal, for example.
Yeah.
But I think that women who are naturally cycling are probably better or like more flexible and resilient to hormonal changes than women who are not, just because our bodies are experienced with it. And so that would be my hypothesis about what's behind that. But like, I have not seen it tested and I don't know whether I'm right.
And yeah, I mean, it sounds like you would be right. And it's just unfortunate that we don't have that information and that research, but maybe one day. There are a few other things I would love for us to figure out down the line too. I mean, for people like me who my puberty and growth was really stunted by an eating disorder, by anorexia when I was younger. And so I never had an actual cycle. I didn't ovulate, I didn't have a period before I was prescribed hormonal birth control. And so I really, for the first time in my life, I had an actual ovulatory cycle where I ovulated and then had a period in my early 20s. And so we'll see what happens later down the line. But I mean, I struggled with, insomnia, panic attacks, anxiety, depression, all of these things from before even I was prescribed hormonal birth control, but it was heightened by the birth control pill. So if you or any other scientist wants to follow along with my brain development over the rest
Yeah,
of my life,
seriously.
let me know.
Yeah, that's actually
Yeah,
that's really interesting. Can I just ask a follow-up question?
absolutely.
Did your symptomology get better or worse when you were on the pill?
It got worse.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, it got worse. And then within a week of stopping hormonal birth control pills, I was on the combo pill. I started sleeping again, which was amazing because I was in sleep clinics. I was a test study for what is going on. I did brain scans. I was doing a ton of stuff throughout this 8 or so year period. And all it took was I stopped the pill after I was doing my own research and reading books and listening to women on, it wasn't even so much that women were talking about this on social media at the time. And this was also before TikTok was even a thing, but it was just books. I was listening to podcasts and I was reading books, and I was like, you know what? Let's just try it. Stopped the pill. Within a week, I was sleeping again, which sleep had been such a big struggle of mine. That was like the most present struggle. And then there were things that I personally did not necessarily equate to the birth control pill, like the anxiety and the extreme mood fluctuations, but all of those also cleared up within about 6 to 12 months of stopping the pill. So
Wow.
there it is. I know.
There it is.
Well, thank you so much for joining me and for spending time with us today and sharing your wealth of knowledge. I just really enjoy talking to you and listening to your work. I'm so excited for this new book to come out. When is that coming out?
Thank you. Oh, it's going to be a little while because I'm still
Okay.
I'm about halfway.
No pressure. Okay.
I'm about halfway done. So I think I'm going to be turning it in October or November,
Wonderful.
which means it'll be out the following October, November.
Okay. Oh, amazing. And I will link up anything and everything that you tell me to, including your social media and your website and your book. This is Your Brain on Birth Control in the show notes of this episode so that everyone can connect with you. And can I just say, you are such a ray of sunshine as well, truly. You're over there all smiley as we're talking about very complex, nuanced, and honestly tough and infuriating topics. So anyway, you were all smiley over there and I love it.
Thank you. I found that I can say a lot more scandalous things when I smile real big. Like, she's harmless.
I totally get what you mean. Well, thank you again. Any final notes for the listeners before we sign off for the day?
No, I don't have anything. So
okay.
Thank you again for having me.
Of course, thank you everyone who tuned in to today's episode. If you found it at all helpful, useful, inspirational, educational, please do share it with a loved one, family, friend, you name it. And connect with Sarah and I on social media. We love to hear from you all. Thank you so much. And until next time, peace, love, hormones.